Hi, I'm Jacquire King, and I've been making records professionally for more than 30 years. I've had a fantastic journey and worked with many amazing artists along the way. I've got some tips and tricks I'd like to share with you from behind the scenes of the record-making process. The challenges of mixing. Well, it can be very tricky. It's either at the end of a production process where you've listened to the material a lot, or it could be something that you're mixing and haven't heard until you get the files and you're not as familiar. So it's finding that objective perspective. That's a very challenging thing. But let's address the situation where you're getting tracks from someone else. Ask for a rough mix. Ask for the rough mix so that you can compare the balances that you're establishing and not get too far off from where at least they last heard it or what their vision was going into finishing the production or the recording. That's important because if you don't know where their mindset was, then you can head off in a direction that may be a wonderful direction, but if it doesn't connect with them, all the time you spent and the familiarity you've created is sort of wasted if they don't love it. Now, sometimes you're maybe given the directive to just kind of have at it and they really want you to bring a new vision to it. Okay, great. You still should have a rough mix, at least as a reference point, because even though that's what they say, you're still going to find that they will refer to things in the rough mix. That leads me to another challenge. Don't listen to the rough mix too much or too long. Use it as a reference point. If you discover some instrumentation in the arrangement that maybe you weren't hearing before or you didn't notice before, quickly referencing the rough mix will tell you like how loud they had it or where they had it placed, if you can hear it at all. So it's good for that, but don't over listen to it. It's a reference point. Then another challenge in reference listening is if you're using other people's released work, other artists' released work, to have like you have a goal in mind and you want it to sound like X, Y, or Z, you might want to listen to that to sort of see what that sounds like and how it's comparing to what you're doing. That's good, but don't do it too much, especially in your mixing environment. If you're going to make those types of comparisons, do those comparisons away from the studio when you're checking the progress of your work or how it translates to other systems. Because you're emotionally sort of safeguarding yourself against feeling potentially not good about what you're doing compared to someone else's music. The other things to keep in mind in that is that what you're doing is not mastered, it will not be as loud, and so it also makes it a tough comparison. Listening to it out out of the studio is a better way to navigate that, but a pitfall is to over-listen to the rough mix or reference tracks, especially as you get the mix really progressed to a point of where you're past 70% of the completion of the job, because then you're going to hear things very differently, and you'll start making bad decisions. So that's a pitfall. Let's talk about some other pitfalls. You should start a mix. Maybe listen to that rough mix reference, but get your rough balance together. Balance everything, and sort of discover what's in there. Balance it before you start going and spending too much time listening to the individual elements, because you might solo up the bass instrument, and while it sounds fine in the general balance in the mix, it might not be the greatest sounding bass ever recorded. It might actually be less than great, but that potentially can be okay. It can take a while sometimes to understand, after doing a lot of mixing, how elements should sound so they fit together. So everything can't be full frequency, so maybe the bass doesn't sound great individually on its own, but it works in the context of the mix and the song and the production, right? So don't over listen in isolation. Make a general balance. check things individually so you just understand what they sound like, but don't spend too much time listening to it in solo. Put things together. And then another pitfall is sort of related to that, in that don't start working on the individual sounds before you get the overall balance together and you put some sort of mix bus treatment on your final mixing stage, however you're summing things together, whether it's complicated multi-bus situation, whatever you've got to get it down to stereo. So whatever that process and that chain is, establish that first, because you're going to do things like equalization, a little bit of compression, maybe some peak stop limiting. Make those things happen first so that you're affecting the overall balance you've made. And then you sort of work from there, from that overall sound to get the individual things to kind of serve that better. Then you'll have an idea of how you want to EQ that bass or how to get the drums happening. And then at that point, when you break it down to, once you've got your general balance and you've got your overall treatment, then yeah, you do break it down to some individual things, but don't spend too much time on those, because the drums usually take the longest because those that have the most microphones on them. But so yeah, it might take you, I don't know, it might take you 5 minutes, might take you an hour. Regardless, get it to a place of where it feels organized and comfortable and it's headed where you're going, and then start adding the other stuff in. Not until you have added most of the instrumentation and vocals in do you really know how loud the snare should be, how bright it should be, how the low end works with the other things that are going on. I mean, you may have a really low synth that is helping the bass and has to fit around the kick drum, and until you make a huge kick drum and then suddenly you turn on the bass and the low synth and it's just like, well, they can't all exist together like this. I can't really hear any definition on any of them. So maybe if you spent too much time making a huge kick drum sound, you kind of wasted your time. Other pitfalls that I can think of: work as quickly as you can. Don't get bogged down in the weeds. If make a little bit of progress on something, move on. The perspective is really important. You can get down a wormhole and really take, you really get your ears fatigued, your mind fatigued, and you sort of lose perspective. And speaking of that, take breaks often. It can be a really, it puts you at a disadvantage to sit and grind for hours on end and not get away from what you're listening to. Go have a conversation with somebody. Call somebody. Make a tea. Have some food. Go outside. Do something. Distract your mind. Read something for 5 minutes. Just change what your focus is, and then kind of come back. It'll really help you be really effective, because you'll come back in and you'll immediately notice things that need attention, as opposed to when you get super hyper-focused for long periods of time, all that other stuff that you're not focusing on sort of loses a basis of relativity to what you're focused on. So if you get a break and get away and kind of come back, you'll be much more effective. Other pitfalls: listening too loud for too long. Don't do that either, because while that is a useful thing, especially for listening to the impact and the low end and the energy, the excitement of something, you need to turn it up to feel it and to get that low end response. But it will burn your ears out, and it will make it hard to listen at the lower levels, which are also really critical for balancing things like the mid-range and the transient response of how bright and articulate certain things are. And then also vocal level. When you crank it way up, everything kind of just sounds good and glued together, because you're involving the acoustic space, and it's doing a lot of natural things. It's doing something to your ears. It's getting the speakers to kind of get up into the place where they're really resonant and filling the sound out. You bring the space into it. Natural compression of your ears. So things start to sound more blended together and unified. So don't listen too loud too long. Listening at lower volumes will help you identify where your vocal level actually should be. The last mixing pitfall I'd like to leave you with is the level at which you're printing and making your mix. It's not going to be as loud as those other artist references, because that stuff's mastered and finished. And it may not even be as loud as the rough mix they give you, because typically what happens in a rough mix is, they're trying to make it exciting for people to listen to for a while. Maybe they've got to show it to a friend or a label or whatever. And so they generally put some one-step processing on it that really jacks the level up and makes it really hot. But that's not the way to mix. So a lot of times what I'll do with a rough mix that's been heated up to like almost like CD level is I'll actually gain it down so that it, and sometimes that's only going to be a dB or 2, sometimes 3. Hopefully it's not louder than you need to gain it down 3, but bring it down a little bit so that when you switch between your mix and maybe something you're referencing, that it doesn't sound louder and kind of throw you off, because sometimes volume makes us feel like something's better. But don't print your mixes too loud. That's what mastering is for. Now, with some clients, I try to avoid this, but for some clients, they need to hear it louder to have confidence in it. Do that as a separate step. Do that as a secondary step. Don't be working with the over loud mastered level as a general thing, because it takes out some of the dynamic and nuance, and you want to make sure that you're building that stuff in there. So just be really careful about the level that you're working at. I'm generally trying to mix at a good streaming level. So on an LUFS meter, I'm looking for about -13 to -11 in the short term as my goal for the way I print my mixes. Hopefully these ideas help. Peace.